What is up, Steeler fans, and welcome back to, I got to be honest, it's one of my favorite podcasts that I do in the offseason. It's the Monday Morning Conversation. We are debuting the Monday Morning Conversation for the first time since the 2024 season ended. And what better way to do that than to welcome my buddy, Kevin Smith, Coach Kevin Smith, do some chalk talk. What's up, Kevin?
Jeff, how are you, man? Appreciate you having me on.
No problem. I have a lot we talk a lot about football. We do the NFL whip around on the FFS and NFL feed, and people hear your takes on the Here We Go Steelers show with Brian Davis. But I want to give you an opportunity to not be a fan for a second and just be a coach. And I wanted to talk about the Steelers 2024 season. And I know that we've spoken off the air before about how frustrating this team has been. And we're going to break it down offense, defense, and special teams. But I want to know I want brutal honesty from you, Coach. I don't want you to hold any punches. No holds barred. All right. We're not talking about Hulk Hogan here. We're talking about your takes on the Steelers. So real quick, though, just from a overarching perspective, would you say 2024 in any way, shape, or form was a success for the Steelers?
I think 2024 is a season that you'll consider a success based upon your perspective of how that season evolved. And what I mean by that is they get off to this 10-3 start, and expectations are really high. And there's this sense that, hey, maybe the Steelers are an actual Super Bowl contender. And then they don't win another game. And so obviously the way that things played out over the last month or so was extremely disappointing. If you rearrange their regular season schedule and you take some of those games, those really challenging games at the end, and you disperse them throughout the schedule so that the Steelers aren't 10-3, but maybe they're 8-5 on their way to being 10-7, I think people have a very, very different perspective on this team. I think there was a little bit of a false sense of who this team was because of a soft early schedule and some close wins that they were able to pull out. And then, of course, the rigorous backload at the end there exposed them. And so here we are all feeling very disappointed in the way that things played out. I just wonder, had the schedule been arranged differently, if we'd feel similarly.
I mean, when you think about the schedule, you bring this up, it's a great point. Look at the final stretch that they had. You know, you had Philly, you had Baltimore, you had Cincinnati, who's a good football team in there. It was tough. I mean, it was a really tough stretch. I still look back at the two losses to Indianapolis and Dallas and say that was by far the worst, because those were games against subpar teams that they should have won. If you remember, Anthony Richardson leaves the game in Indianapolis. Joe Flacco comes in and is able to move them down the field with regularity on way to win. And then the thunderstorm, lightning storm delayed Sunday Night Football game against the Cowboys, where Dak Prescott in the waning minutes drives down and connects on a touchdown to win the football game. Those two losses, in my opinion, were way worse than any down the stretch. Yes, like you're right. You lose those games, but I don't think anyone would have been upset if they mixed them in. I think that's a good point, but I always look back on those two games. Do you do the same, or are you different?
No, you're right. Those are absolutely games you feel as though the Steelers should have won, but there's always going to be a game or two like that in the season, especially when for a Pittsburgh team, you're not talking about a group that is significantly better than anybody else. I mean, they should beat those teams, but you can understand why they don't, because they've got deficiencies or shortcomings in areas that if they get exposed, they're going to pay for it. Like think about the Dallas game, the last play of the game, where the Cowboys score on 4th and goal from the 5. It's not literally the last play, but it's basically the last play. I don't know, 20 seconds left. Yeah. They score on 4th and goal from the 5. How do they score on that touchdown? They expose rookie slot corner Beanie Bishop, who was a guy as an undrafted free agent who had a nice season for the Steelers. But that was an area of weakness on the roster that Pittsburgh never adequately addressed and had to play an undrafted free agent. And in a big moment, he kind of got exposed. So I think that's another element of this season overall. There were some areas of concern heading into the season where people were like, hey, did they do enough here to address their weaknesses? And the answer turned out to be no. And that wound up hurting the Steelers. Slot corner, wide receiver, depth on the offensive line are the three that jump out.
All right. Well, we'll talk about those as we get to those specific parts of the football field and the team. But again, I don't want fan Kevin Smith. I want Coach K.T. Smith to analyze the Steelers here. Let's start on offense. I want to just take you look back at Arthur Smith's first year with the Steelers, and as of this being recorded, he's going to be back next year. As a coach, when you watched Arthur Smith's offense, what were your takeaways? Positive, negative? I'm sure that you and I have similar hairstyles. I'm sure you were interested in pulling any hair on your head out watching this team.
Okay, so I'll start with the positive. I think he's a good play designer. I think he does a nice job of being able to get the defense into situations that are advantageous. He did a nice job with shifts and motions. We came out of the Matt Canada era, and Matt Canada was built as this sort of guru of pre-snap movement. But it always felt like he did it because he thought it was going to trick the defense. And that just doesn't happen in the NFL. Whereas Arthur Smith did it to create legitimate advantages, or to get more numbers at the point of attack, or to move guys around to create a matchup that he wanted. He was good in that regard. But he was stubborn, man. He was stubborn. I was just telling you before the show, I just finished up this deep dive on the first Steelers results on both sides of the ball on first downs. I'm a big believer that first down is the most important down of a possession. And they're bad, man. The Steelers lost first down by an average of more than 1.6 yards per play to their opponents. And on when they had the ball, man, they ran it 60% of the time on first down, despite the fact that their first down efficiency was bad. So they just kept running it, even though the numbers didn't bear out that they should keep running the football. And that was really frustrating. They were 39% efficient on first down running the football. You want your efficiency rate to be around 50. And throwing the ball, they were just over 50. So they were clearly better throwing the ball more on first down than running the ball, yet they ran it 60% of the time. That stubbornness is frustrating.
Okay, so how much of it, though, you talk about Arthur Smith and the stubbornness, I get it. What about the personnel, though? I mean, they were lacking in a lot of areas. And let's not forget, and I think sometimes Steeler fans forget this, I believe it was the first 6 weeks of the regular season, the Steelers had a different offensive line pairing, combo, whatever you want to call it. When you think about Isaac Seumalo missed the first 4 games due to his pectoral injury. James Daniels leaves with a ruptured Achilles tendon. Broderick Jones and Troy Fautanu are being swapped in and out at right tackle. It took them a while. They eventually settle in on Frazier and McCormick at center and right guard. Frazier even misses some time when he gets injured prior to the bye week. Let's not just talk about the offensive line, though. The wide receiver position you already mentioned, they knew they needed help there, and they just refused to do it. They never pulled the trigger. Was Arthur Smith hamstrung with the offense that he had at his disposal?
Absolutely. Absolutely. He goes into the season expecting Daniels, Fautanu. Originally, it was Nate Herbig at center. All 3 of those guys don't play a snap for the Steelers. I mean, actually, Daniels played a few, but they're lost for the year early in the season. And now, Zach Frazier had a great rookie year, but he had to go through some growing pains. Mason McCormick was not ready to be a starter. He battled in there, man. He played adequate football. But the problem was this: Arthur Smith designed a scheme for the unit he thought he was going to have, and then he didn't have that unit. And it was really heavily reliant upon zone schemes, particularly that wide zone scheme where, or outside zone. And they ended up having some guys that just weren't great at it. I mean, Mason McCormick is not an outside zone guy. He's an old school gap blocker, man. He wants to get his hand in the dirt and get down on people, vertical push. And you were asking him to reach up to the second level on linebackers. He just couldn't do it. And then at the wide receiver position, clearly not good enough, man. You know, like George Pickens had some moments where he showed that he was a wide receiver one, but he also had some meltdowns and showed that he wasn't mature enough to handle that load. And then beyond him, you had a bunch of role players, and they I think felt like they had to run the football because they knew they weren't good enough on the perimeter. So while the frustration with Arthur Smith, I think is legitimate, I wouldn't have wanted the hand that he was dealt. I wouldn't have wanted to have to call plays under those circumstances.
So the offensive line shuffled. We just talked about that, but how difficult is it for a coach? You have the experience to be able to answer this question, at least in some regard, for the first 6 weeks. Because remember, Russell Wilson injures his calf on the first day of training camp. And so now all of a sudden, any plan that you had in place for Russell Wilson kind of has to go on the shelf. And now you have to design something for Justin Fields, which we all saw it. He is a completely different quarterback than Russell Wilson is in almost every regard. And so for 6 weeks, you orchestrate an offense that's able to get you to 4-2. And then the head coach makes a decision. I stand by this. I don't think Arthur Smith wanted to go to Russell Wilson. I think he wanted Justin Fields to remain in as the starter for whatever reason. How difficult is it for an offensive coordinator to pivot from the Justin Fields package, we'll call it, to now Russell Wilson?
It's really hard because, one, you've got to think about practice reps. How good are you going to be running this stuff on Sunday if you have to revamp what you're doing throughout the week based upon who the quarterback is going to be? I mean, the continuity of a system is so important, particularly in the NFL, where the really good offenses, they don't recreate themselves in midstream. Like they don't get to week 5 and say, all right, we're going to put in a whole new scheme. What they do is they start to tweak the stuff that they've already put on film. They basically say, hey, we put this on film for 4 weeks now, and our opponents are going to have this down. How can we show them something that looks like that and then tweak it so it's not exactly that? But what the Steelers were now doing was they were saying, let's take out a lot of what we had done with quarterback A and put in all this new stuff with quarterback B. And ultimately that caught up to them, because when you think about how it looked great at first, right? Here comes Russell Wilson. And for the first several weeks, the offense just takes off. Well, that was because it was like a new offense. And teams didn't have the film on what Pittsburgh wanted to do with Wilson. But you get later into that run and the defenses catch up. And now what's Arthur Smith going to do? Is he going to reinvent himself again? I think they were limited with the personnel, and they couldn't make those tweaks that I was just talking about. You know, they couldn't do that, that rather than reinvent themselves, just tweak it. And the better teams just caught up to them.
So you're bringing up really solid points, and it makes me wonder, outside of the stubbornness factor that you mentioned, is the criticism of Arthur Smith kind of unwarranted based on all the things that we just talked about?
I could see why the Steelers would want to bring him back. I mean, I'm not one of these people clamoring for a new offensive coordinator. I just believe that what Arthur Smith planned and prepared for and what he ultimately got were two very different things.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about the offense moving forward. It's going to be interesting this offseason. You don't expect Najee Harris back. There's people that have talked about George Pickens maybe not being back. I mean, this offense, do you have hope for year 2 of Arthur Smith based on, I mean, they would have to go out and they don't have a quarterback right now unless you count Skylar Thompson on a reserve contract. Where's the hope reside? Tell me, Coach. Give me some positives about this offense moving forward.
Well, you've probably read the same things that I've read, the stories that there was some friction between Russell Wilson and Arthur Smith, that Smith really did want Justin Fields. That gives me some hope because it lets me believe that Arthur Smith believes that he could be successful with Justin Fields. And I'm a big advocate for bringing him back. He needs to be QB1 for the Steelers next year, unless they can pull some kind of trade-off to bring an elite quarterback in, which is probably not going to happen. Right. He needs to be the guy. And then you need to build around what he can do well. Like, he showed progress. He showed that he can be a better quarterback than he was in Chicago, but he doesn't have enough weapons. You need field stretchers at the wide receiver position, because you're going to get the box loaded against Justin Fields. I mean, in that first down deep dive that I was doing, the Steelers, when Justin Fields was at quarterback, the Steelers averaged just slightly better than 3 yards per carry running the ball on first down. That's terrible. Well, why? Because defenses were absolutely loading the box and run blitzing him. And, they knew the Steelers were going to run the ball, and they weren't scared by any of their weapons on the outside. If they don't upgrade that wide receiver room and back some teams off, it's not going to matter who's calling plays.
Do you think that Arthur Smith is a man, though, that can orchestrate an offense that will accentuate what Justin Fields does? I'm not saying it has to be full-on Baltimore Ravens with Lamar Jackson, but you think they would have something in place, and the running back position, do they have the backs to also utilize that as well?
I hate to answer a question with a question, but let's ask this. Is Mike Tomlin willing to give Arthur Smith the freedom to open up the offense? Because I think a lot of that stubbornness that we were talking about earlier came from the top. Mike Tomlin openly said it. He openly said that he wants to minimize risk and that throwing the football is risky. He sounded like freaking Woody Hayes when he was making those comments. So I think is Mike Tomlin willing to sort of, I don't want to say get out of the way, but will he give the license to Arthur Smith to let the offense evolve?
It's going to be dicey on the offensive side of the ball, see what the Steelers do, because there's going to be a lot of movement in regards to free agency. I expect them to be big players in free agency at key positions, but let's leave the offense for a second and go to the defensive side of the ball.
Can I say one last thing real quick?
Oh,
Jeff?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
T. Higgins, man. Make a run at T. You stole Patrick Queen away from a division rival last year. I love T. Higgins. I think that guy's a professional wide receiver. And by all accounts, he's been a good team guy, a good locker room guy. I think he can make a world of difference.
If you were a coach, do you try and trade George Pickens? Do you put up with a headache one more year?
I don't know. How bad is it? We don't have that information. The optics are not good. How exhausted would you be if you were Mike Tomlin of the constant coddling and having to go over on this? I mean, in that playoff game, TJ Watt goes over to counsel him. Cam Hayward goes over to counsel him. Russell Wilson. I mean, everybody's having one-on-one counseling sessions with George Pickens on the bench in between series. That can't be where your focus is, man. If that's your focus and he's supposed to be your star player on offense, that's a problem. So can they mediate it? Can they fix it? If the answer is no, move on.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the defense. Last week on a podcast, I tried to draw positives from the 2024 season. And I struggled on the defensive side because I feel like if you're talking about the standard is the standard on the defensive side of the ball is so much higher than the offense. The offense is young. The offense is inexperienced. We just talked about that. The defense is veteran laden, a lot of money pumped into that side of the football. We all know about that. And they just didn't perform the way that we're accustomed to seeing. I think the only players that really did outperform expectation were Cam Hayward and Deshaun Elliott. I mean, outside of that, TJ Watt didn't have a banner year. Alex Highsmith was banged up. Nick Herbig was banged up. Keanu Benton and Joey Porter Jr. in their sophomore years kind of stagnated, in my opinion, didn't really take a step forward nor a step back. What was your overall takeaway of the defense in 2024?
I think that the defensive scheme got stale. And by the time you got to the end of the year, other teams had a real good idea of how they wanted to operate. And, you look at the season finale. Joe Burrow completed 37 passes in that finale. Now, granted, Cincinnati only scored 19 points, so Pittsburgh stood up when they needed to in the red zone. But Joe Burrow looked really confident when he got under center in reading that defense. And, the Baltimore Ravens in the playoff game had 450 some yards and went up and down the field. It just felt like teams knew what was coming from Terrell Austin and that unit. And I think part of the reason is because they are so heavily reliant on those edge players to create pressure that they're not that willing to come out of. They didn't blitz as much as they have in the past, but that they are. If you're not getting home on the edge and you're playing zone behind it, it's really not that tough to pick them apart. So that's got to evolve. The Steelers have to come out of their comfort zone. Mike Tomlin says it all the time, get comfortable being uncomfortable. Well, they don't like to come out of their comfort zone defensively, and it's just caught up to them.
All right, so you brought this up with the offensive side in terms of the calls coming from above. We're talking about Mike Tomlin. Do you think that Terrell Austin, a lot of people, myself included, have said it's time for a change? But I also recognize that, does it matter? Will it matter? Do you think that Mike Tomlin's the one that's ultimately pulling the strings on the defense, and that whoever is hired as the defensive coordinator is just going to be the next guy answering to him in terms of here's what we're going to do? What's your take on that?
That's a good question. I think the Steelers, if they're looking at their two coordinators, the one that they need to take the harder look at is Terrell Austin and decide if he's the right guy for the job. I mean, I was told by a former NFL coach, well, current NFL coach, but a guy who has a lot of experience coaching in and around Terrell Austin, that when he was elevated as the DC in Pittsburgh, there was buzz around the league. Like, really? Because a lot of people didn't necessarily, a lot of guys, on the inside there didn't necessarily think that he was a coordinator, that was his strength, that they thought he was a great secondary coach and a guy who really understood coverages, but not necessarily a guy with a big enough view to be able to put together a top shelf defense, especially with all the talent they had in Pittsburgh. So it'll be very interesting. And maybe that's what Mike Tomlin wanted. Maybe Mike Tomlin just wanted a guy who would do what Mike Tomlin wanted him to do, as opposed to a Aaron Glenn type who can transform a defense. So that'll be interesting. And, again, the question comes back to Mike Tomlin. What is Mike Tomlin willing to do to evolve in what will be his 19th season in Pittsburgh?
Well, going back to Terrell Austin quickly, you talk about how everyone said that he's a good secondary coach because that was his background. Was the Steelers secondary even good this year?
I mean, the optics of it certainly weren't great. But that's an interesting question too, because you had a lot of new pieces. And how many times watching the defense this year did you see after a play these guys turn to one another and kind of start throwing up their hands or pointing? Yep. And there were a ton of communication issues. And again, you've got 3 out of the 4 starters in the secondary, either young, as in Joey Porter's case, or brand new, bringing in Jackson and bringing in Elliott. You got Patrick Queen now orchestrating it all, who's brand new. I mean, Patrick Queen had a ton of communication issues with his fellow back seven. And I think there was a lot of growth that needed to take place this year. And unfortunately, that growth was happening on the fly. So, no, I don't think they were a great secondary. But once you become a coordinator, you're no longer focused on the position group as much as you are on, obviously, the bigger picture. And maybe what you've done with Austin is you've taken him away from his strength to put him into a position that's not necessarily a strength of his.
I think one of the most stunning statistical declines that we've seen in the Steelers since Terrell Austin took over as the defensive coordinator is sack production. It's been a steady decrease almost every single year, to the point where they only had 40 sacks this past season. And that ranked them in the bottom third of the league. I mean, this is a team that used to lead the league in sacks as a team when Keith Butler was the one orchestrating the pass rush. What the hell's going on with the Steelers pass rush? Because on paper, they should be an elite group, yet they are not. They don't have the production. What's going on there?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the sacks from the linebackers, I'm not talking about the edge players, the interior backers, the safeties, the slot corner, that stuff's all down. Think back to when Mike Hilton was here, right? Mike Hilton would have 4 or 5 sacks a year because they would draw up all these, creative zone blitzes and find ways to get home. And now they are just reliant on the front four. If they're in their base defense, which is pretty much a 2-4-5, they're relying on the 2 interior defensive tackles and the 2 edge rushers to get to the quarterback. And what opposing offenses did around mid-season this year is they just said, TJ Watt's not going to beat us. And he got chipped and doubled for the rest of the year. And it wore him out. You could see he was physically worn down by the end of the season. In essence, they said, we're willing to roll the dice on Highsmith or Herbig going one-on-one on the backside. And Highsmith got off to a great season, but then he got dinged up. And Herbig's a little bit of a one-trick pony. He's a speed rusher, and he can beat those more cumbersome offensive tackles, but a really good one he's going to struggle with. And Cam Hayward had a nice year, but Ogunjobi and Benton, as you mentioned, those guys didn't get to the quarterback as much. If you're completely reliant on the front four, they better get home.
So where do we go from here on the defensive side of the ball? That's the tough question. On the offense, you're like, well, we got a lot of young talent. They're going to probably spend some money in free agency. The defense, where do you go here if you're the coach?
Well, just like with the offense, they have to be willing to change their philosophy a little bit. They can't be as stubborn. The offense was stubborn to their own detriment in running the football on first down. The defense is going to have to find ways to get back to creating sacks, not just like scheming them up, not just saying, hey, our dudes are going to be better than your dudes, because that clearly wasn't the case this year. They're going to have to, but if you're going to scheme your stunts up, and that means, you're bringing second level guys, then you got to play more man-to-man coverage and be willing to be more aggressive in the secondary. Maybe they didn't feel like they had those guys this year. So maybe they're going to have to address the cornerback position and be a little more willing to take some chances on the back end to get home.
All right, let's finish this up with special teams. I do want to talk about this is the first year with the quote unquote dynamic kickoff return. I don't think until they move the touchback to like 35 will that actually be the case. But I want to ask you what your thoughts were, not from Chris Boswell. And I thought Corliss Waitman filled in amazing for Cameron Johnson. I mean, he had one bad play, really. It was the punt in the blizzard up in Cleveland, which was like a shank. But other than that, I thought Corliss Waitman and Chris Boswell were fantastic. But from a coverage unit and a return unit, I want to ask what your take was of Danny Smith, his unit this year. They did have a punt return for a touchdown. Calvin Austin III is the first one in Pittsburgh since 2019. That's pretty incredible to think about. What was your takeaway from kickoff coverage, punt coverage, as well as the return units?
I didn't think the kickoff coverage was great when they kicked it into the landing zone and they let teams run it back. I don't have the numbers on it, but I'd be willing to bet my house that they averaged more than the 30-yard line, which is where you get the ball if you just kick it to the back of the end zone. But I think that was true across the league. I'm pretty confident that the league-wide starting position in this dynamic kickoff was better than it has been in previous years. I just kick the damn ball through the end zone every time. I don't know why teams don't, because the number of times that they pin you inside the 30 versus you getting outside the 30 is minimal. The special teams created some explosives, had a couple block kicks again. The big punt return. I thought it was a pretty solid unit. Danny Smith got as much camera time as you're ever going to see a special teams coach get. I don't know. They all love him chewing that gum, Yeah. But I think it's a solid unit, and you forget that Cameron Johnston is one of the best punters in the NFL because Waitman did such a good job filling in. So I think that they're obviously going to have to replace Cordero Patterson. He won't be back, and upgrade that. And I don't know where that comes from exactly. You don't want to use Jalen Warren as your kick returner. He's going to be RB1 next year, I'd imagine. So they're going to have to find another returner. Austin is not a kick returner. He can return punts, but he will get annihilated returning kicks. So they're going to have to address that position. But other than that, I think it's a pretty solid unit.
Okay. Now for the toughest part of this whole thing, Coach. We both were educators. And when we had a parent-teacher conference, I was told very early on in my career, finish on a positive. Always leave the parent leaving after you said something positive. So you say the negative stuff first, and then you finish with the positive. So they leave thinking, well, maybe it wasn't that bad after all. I want you to do the same thing with the Steelers. What are some reasons for hope for this Steelers team in 2025? This is a tough question, I think.
Well, I think they're going to be better on offense. I really do. I believe if you sign Justin Fields and you bring him back and you spend the entire offseason building the offense around him, Remember, they didn't do any of that last year. Russ was the guy. They signed Russ first, and they thought that that he'd be the perfect quarterback for Arthur Smith, and then they signed Fields, and then Russ got hurt, and then they had to figure it all out. If you've had a year now to evaluate Justin Fields, Arthur Smith's had a year to get comfortable in Pittsburgh, and if they put those two back together, along with another solid addition on the offensive line, along with an upgraded wide receiver room, I feel like this will be a better offense. And defensively, like I said, if they run it back, shame on them, because they were clearly exposed down the stretch. All the better teams had this team down, know exactly what they were doing. My God, watching the Chiefs RPO the Steelers to death, and the Steelers acting like they'd never seen an RPO. Like, what is this mysterious thing that they're doing? Like, they've got to evolve. They got to take a hard look at what they're doing defensively and really get modern. The Steelers are not a modern football team on either side of the ball. And they need to take a good look at what some of the better units are doing, especially on defense, and reevaluate.
Damn it, Coach. Is that supposed to make me feel better? You just made me feel worse. What the hell are you doing? Reasons for hope. They need to evolve.
This is one of the first times in a long time. You probably got to go back to like 2017, where I feel better about the offense heading into the offseason than I do the defense. There was clearly more talent on defense, but I just think their scheme is stale. Yeah. I think that with Justin Fields on the offense, you have an opportunity to really modernize what you're doing. Whereas on the defensive side of the ball, I think it's going to come down to a question of, are they willing? Do they think that what they're doing is good enough? Because it kind of makes me feel like they do. And that's what I'm worried about. But you want a positive. So here it is. They got the highest paid defense in the NFL. They've got a lot of talent on that unit. Now let's figure out how to put it to its best use.
All right, Coach, I want to let you plug your Call Sheet Daily podcast that you've been running now for a couple weeks. It's good stuff. Go ahead and tell the listeners how they can find you.
Yeah, it's been great, man. We're having a lot of fun doing it. We have a different theme for each day. Today on Thursday, our theme is what we call the Portal. It's our college football show. FFSN's Big G, Sean Gurley, is on with me today talking about Ohio State's run to the national championship. How did they do it? And we're talking about a lot of the pro prospects out of that Ohio State class. I end the show by asking him, I said, hey, man, if you could pick one or two Buckeyes to land in Pittsburgh next year, who would you pick? So he had about 7 guys that he wanted for the Steelers. And then tomorrow's show, Friday, that's what we call our Friday forecast. That's when we sort of forecast the upcoming weekend in the NFL, and we'll do a deep dive on the championship games. 15-minute shows. They drop at 10 a.m. Monday through Friday. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, check it out. The Call Sheet Daily, wherever you get your podcast, you can find it. You can also follow him on Twitter at KT Smith FFSN. That does it, Coach. Thanks for your time, man. I appreciate it. Until next time, take it easy.